Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about our next guest. And we're going to have a discussion now that you will not find in mainstream news media anywhere else in New Zealand. And that is because they have largely decided that climate change caused by man is going to destroy the planet, and you're not allowed to say that isn't true. You're not allowed to say that isn't true, despite the fact that the IPCC has downgraded its predictions about global warming quite drastically ahead of the last COP summit in Egypt. Despite the fact that new studies show that methane gas is 30% less damaging or less worrying to the environment than previously thought. Despite the fact that the worst predictions about climate change and particularly sea level rise made by Al Gore have simply not come to pass. That we have not had mass extinctions. That the ice has not disappeared from the North Pole or the South Pole. And that despite the breathless reporting by our news media here in New Zealand, there are not more extreme, wetter and wilder weather events than there used to be. All of that, despite all of that clear evidence that the moral and political panic over climate change has been over-egged, in this country you are not allowed to say that in mainstream media, or you will be branded a heretic and basically tarred and feathered and run from the town square. Well, our next guest is visiting New Zealand soon. And I imagine some will come for him as a heretic. His name is Thomas Sheahen. He's a scientist from the US, and he's suggesting that CO2 is not the terrible bogey gas that we have painted it to be. Dr. Sheahen joins us now live by video link from the United States. Do you mind if I call you Thomas?
Just Tom is fine.
Tom, pleased to meet you. Where are you talking to us from?
Well, I live in far western Maryland, which is almost out to Ohio. It's about 200 miles from the Atlantic Ocean and about 400 miles from the Mississippi River.
Good on you. Now, Tom, when are you due down here in New Zealand, and who is bringing you down? Who are you visiting?
Well, Jock Allison has been my coordinator, but I'll be going to a number of things. First, the farming gathering right off the bat on the 15th and 16th up in the North Island, then progressing to many different venues throughout both the North and the South Island as I visit with various farming groups who have been arranged to meet with me.
All right. Thomas, climate change for the last 15, 20 years, ever since Al Gore made that documentary, and perhaps before that, has been one of the most discussed, talked about, worried about phenomenons of the modern era. We have, though I note that attendance is dropping, we have school children regularly in this country and around the world going on strike because they believe their world is going to end in some sort of fiery case of sunburn if they do not stop driving cars, stop eating red meat, which is an issue we've just been dealing with. Do you think all this moral panic is justified?
Of course not. No, it's a tremendous mistake. There are those who call it a hoax, and I will not go quite that far, but mistake is a very accurate term. They have misunderstood the role of CO2 in the atmosphere, and as a result, they have built their way at the scaffold of imaginary fears that have resulted in frightening people. The saddest case is this unfortunately handicapped girl in Sweden known as Greta Thunberg, and she has carried with her an awful lot of other teens and young people into this panic mode.
All right, we're talking about Greta Thunberg, who is constantly outraged that people live adult lives. She has a huge global influence, Tom. She's a superstar.
It is certainly true, and unknown to practically everyone is a German girl who's about the same age named Naomi Seibt, who has studied climate issues carefully, even though she's in the lower age bracket, probably 15, 20, something like that. And you listen to Naomi, and she is very soundly based in correct reasoning and science. And one of the phrases for Naomi is persona non grata. That is to say, she isn't Greta, and she's the person that they really, really don't like among the global warmists group.
Well, climate change, though, we've got to say, Tom, does exist because the climate changes. I've always called it weather.
Good point. The climate is always changing. It changes from morning to noon to night. It changes by the seasons. It changes due to sunspots. It changes due to the Earth's obliquity and ellipsoidal orbit. It changes due to the Pacific decadal oscillation, the currents in the Atlantic and the currents in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. All these factors make changes. And furthermore, when you're not looking, there's an underwater volcano goes off, and nobody notices that until months and months later. A gentleman from Australia named Ian Plimer has been a real expert on all of these different causes over many centuries. And he's found that the wild card that nobody notices is the undersea volcanoes.
Given all the science which runs counter to the paranoia, to the Greta Thunberg pronouncements on climate change, why do you think it is that man-made climate change has become the moral panic that it is here in the early 21st century?
Well, it's fashionable to be frightened by something horrible that you can't imagine around the bend. It is helpful to newspapers and media to get the top headlines and the more eyeballs to make something dangerous and panicky. And if you told people that the temperature of the Earth is going to rise by 1.5 C, they would yawn, they would close the newspaper, they'd turn to the comic pages, they'd change the channel, they'd stop being interested, because the real numbers that are going to happen, based on the best science we actually know, is that we're in for a temperature change of about 1.5 C. And nobody is going to panic over that.
Well, I noticed, Tom, before the latest COP conference in Egypt, the IPCC itself came out and said we are revising drastically downwards our global temperature increase predictions to the end of the century. They said we'd be lucky to reach 2 degrees increase, which seemed to me to be an earth-shattering admission or change in the computer modelling that in many ways destroyed almost the entire rationale for the sorts of extremist policies in agriculture and carbon sinking that the world still seems to be pursuing with a religious fervour.
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That change by the IPCC did cut the legs out from under the entire field of worry and panic. And when the working group of the IPC, the scientific working group 1, said that and took away a particularly ugly scenario known as RCP 8.5, at that point, the summary for policymaker portion of the IPCC, who doesn't pay any attention to the scientists, ignored it and went right on writing fear-mongering. And it's a tragedy that there could be allowed this terrible disconnect between the bureaucrats and politicians on the one hand and the honest and capable scientists on the other hand.
The problem for someone like...
What you said is absolutely right.
Yep.
There's nothing left to worry about.
Yep. The problem with that is, Thomas, you're going to come down here and you're going to talk science, right? Because that's what you do. Yes. That's what you're expert in. I'd say...
Exactly so, yeah.
And I'd put the theory to you that this problem is now past the science because we are in a problem of perception and climate change has become a religion. And it requires heretics now to say this religion is based on a falsehood. And as you mentioned, the mainstream news media have bought into this religion. So this is not now a boat, a Titanic that is going to be turned around by logical scientific debate. It is going to have to be a philosophical and a religious conflict.
That is true, and I'm hoping to stiffen the spine of the farmers in New Zealand by showing them that they are right and the global warming fanatics are wrong, so that they will go with their strength to the political parties who are in charge of New Zealand and carry out a change at the level of politics and government simply because the farmers have much strength. In America, every now and then, the farmers in about February, which means the winter in our country, will all get together and drive their tractors hundreds of miles so as to circle around the streets of Washington, D.C. And boy, do they ever get the attention of the Congress. And the congressmen don't forget that.
Yeah.
And after that, they get treated with it. But they do it because of their big numbers, because of their resolve, because of their unity. And if I can do one thing in the next couple of weeks in New Zealand, it will be to encourage them to remain united and strong and to realize that science is on their side.
Tom, do you feel that, if you like, and excuse the pun, the climate around the climate change debate is changing? And more people, the further away we get from that first Al Gore documentary, are saying, this just hasn't happened. The predictions have been wrong and wildly inaccurate.
Right. It has gotten to be a subject of humor, that if something goes wrong, somebody's house burns down, you say it's because of climate change. Anything that goes wrong, you just casually say climate change, and it's become a comical excuse. So the people out there in the reality, the hinterlands, the farmers, the people, the workers, the guys who go to work in the morning of jobs, they don't believe in the climate change mythology anymore at all. And Al Gore, as a public figure in the United States, is often ridiculed because of all his fancy homes, his fancy airplanes. He's very overweight. And him preaching to the rest of us about how we should stop eating meat or whatever because of the horror of climate change is falling on very deaf ears.
Tom.
And I hope it's that way in New Zealand too.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, we went pretty long way down the climate change rabbit hole in this country. Are you suggesting then, and you don't say, the interesting thing is you don't say that CO2 isn't bad, that it doesn't have some effect on climate, but you're saying the idea that we have the ability as human beings to do anything about these trends is ridiculous. We really shouldn't be. I mean, like the Paris Accord on climate change, are you telling me that's basically should be a dead letter now? It's really got no scientific basis. Wow. Do you see how many bureaucrats are invested in that, though? How difficult it is culturally to abandon these now meaningless policies?
Well, the thing that strikes me as weird is that the UN, sitting up there in Europe, Brussels and so forth, Paris Accord, ... have somehow convinced the very small nation of New Zealand that they should be good citizens, set a good example, and commit suicide, economic suicide.
Yeah.
And I cannot understand why New Zealand hasn't invoked that article in the Paris Accord that says we will not diminish the food supply from any country. I don't know why New Zealand doesn't just slam the door shut on the IPCC, saying it's right there in the document we signed in the Paris Accord that we don't have to jeopardize our food.
Do you think there is another agenda behind the climate change hysteria? Do you think it is being used as a stalking horse or a Trojan horse for wider political change?
Sure, it gives great control. If you can control something as fundamental as fuel and the air, CO2, you can control people on anything. you can get them to get in line and behave according to what you want to do in complete, total dictatorship, essentially. So, yes, there's a wider agenda.
So we should learn to live with climate change and I guess in some ways limit our egos in thinking that we are necessarily in control of everything that happens with our climate or the world, Tom.
Exactly so. The two words that are used with care is adaptation and mitigation. We are all able to engage in adaptation, and man has done so for 100,000 years as the climate has varied all over the place, including ice ages and things like that. Mitigation is a fool's errand. Mitigation is what they're pushing to try to get changes made that will do nothing at all, won't change the temperature a bit, and are just a huge, not only inconvenience and a waste of time, but are damaging to the economic health of the people who submit to the mitigation plan.
Yeah. Thomas, are you meeting with any politicians while you're here, any politicians from any political parties? Because I'll be frank, I think it would be bloody useful for them to talk to you.
Well, I'm not in charge of the schedule, so I don't know who all we'll be meeting with. I'm open to meeting with people of all different stripes, but my understanding as of today is it'll be mostly farmers I'll be talking to.
Yeah. But
if there are interested political figures, elected officials who want to talk to me, I'm certainly willing to do that.
Yeah. Tom, what sort of blowback do you get? And it seems to me to a certain amount that the fight has gone out of the climate changes to a certain extent. But normally, and maybe 5 years ago, someone like you would come to New Zealand and someone would say you're in the pay of big oil, or they'd publish some great expose about your private life or whatever. What are they going to say bad about you when you turn up in New Zealand? Give us a warning.
Well, let's see. As I search across my many failings and weaknesses, I can easily find some that would make people unhappy. But in the area of climate, I have the benefit of being retired, which compared to a university professor is like being emeritus.
Yeah.
And nobody can fire you because they're not paying you. I'm not getting paid by anybody. So nobody can cut off my funding, since I'm living basically on my own retirement income and I can speak as I wish and freely.
All right. Are you politically affiliated in any way?
Oh, sure. I'm a member of the Republican Party in America, and I'm pleased that many of the Republican candidates share the understanding and common sense that the whole climate affair has been blown way out of proportion.
Yeah, and last time I looked, being a member of a political party in the United States wasn't a crime. That's just a matter of choice in your positions. Okay, when are you coming to New Zealand? And where can people find more about your visit? Because I think, and already my text machine tells me a lot of New Zealanders are interested in hearing more from you.
I'm happy to come. I love your country. I've been there twice before, and I just am absolutely stunned by the beautiful magnificence of New Zealand.
Yeah.
I made the trip to Milford Sound twice, and I've never seen more beautiful mountains in my life.
Yeah. When are we? No, what my question was, when are you coming here?
Well, I leave America on the 13th of June. The 14th doesn't exist because of the international dateline. I land in New Zealand on the 15th, and by the afternoon of the 15th, I should be engaged in conversations with some people.
Good on you. Look, that was fascinating. And as I said, I'm not a scientist. I don't get deep into the science. But I'm so glad that you raised that IPCC heating downgrade, which to me, I just sat there and thought logically, I said, how can we keep on with this madness if the science doesn't support it anymore? But it's a lot of people are going to have real problems coming to grips with that. Let's hope you can help them on their way, Tom. I thank you so much for your time today.
Your job on the radio is to tell people that the IPCC did downgrade.
Didn't get much coverage here in New Zealand.
Exactly. Didn't get much coverage in America or Europe or any place else either, because it isn't exciting and it doesn't cause headlines. It's a forget about it, folks message. and that'll show up on page C37 of the Sunday edition.
All right.
It's just not important.
You don't need to convince me that mainstream media don't do their job very well, Tom. Tom, as I said, thank you for your time. Hopefully get to meet you when you're out in New Zealand, and thank you very much indeed for sharing your time with us today. That is Dr. Tom Sheahen.
Thank you.
He is Vice President of the Science and Environment Policy Project, SEPP, Director of the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, that's the ITEST, and President of Western Technology Incorporated, an independent consulting firm specialising in energy technology issues with business implications. And he basically said, man-made climate change, the Paris Accord, the emissions trading scheme, it's all crap because it isn't going to happen. And I think we are. I think this is going to be the challenge for the world for the next 10 or 15 years, is to deconstruct the religion of man-made climate change, because the science simply does not support it anymore. And our mainstream media are going to have to eat a bit of humble and start covering the facts around this issue before we literally commit economic suicide and destroy our farming sector, in my humble opinion.